Today, we are digging into a massive geopolitical puzzle. It's the story of how an enormous American effort to change a government, backed by just overwhelming force, completely failed. And it happened right in its own backyard. So let's get into it, because what went down in Venezuela, well, it isn't just a regional story. It's a really critical look at how the entire landscape of global power is shifting. First, you have to understand the sheer scale of this operation. The force that Washington brought to the table was staggering. We're talking about a carrier strike group led by the USS Gerald R. Ford, F-35 fighter jets, nuclear submarines, the whole nine yards. All told, about 16,000 military personnel were parked just off Venezuela's coast. This was, no joke, the biggest U.S. naval presence in the Caribbean since the Cuban Missile Crisis. The message couldn't have been clearer. And it wasn't just about military might. That pressure was matched by an absolutely intense economic squeeze. U.S. sanctions went after every vital part of the Venezuelan economy, especially its lifeblood, the oil industry. And the result? A UN special rapporteur found that these sanctions caused government revenue to shrink by an incredible 99%. Just think about that. Nearly every single dollar of the government's income was just gone. So that brings us to this central mystery here, right? You've got the full weight of American military and economic power coming down hard, a campaign that by all accounts should have been fatal. So why on earth is Nicolas Maduro still in charge? The attempt to push him out failed, and the reasons why? Well, they reveal a massive shift in how the world works. Okay, to solve this puzzle, our first clue is actually inside Venezuela itself. We've got to look at its surprisingly tough security structure, because this was never going to be an easy target. So here you can see how Maduro basically learned from past attempts to overthrow governments. He created this deliberately messy web of overlapping security forces. You have the regular army, sure, but also the National Guard, and then multiple intelligence agencies that are basically designed to spy on each other. You also have armed civilian groups called colectivos, and a massive national militia. The goal wasn't just defense from the outside, it was to make a quick, clean, internal overthrow pretty much impossible. And this comparison really shows why you can't just look at history as a perfect guide. Look at the U.S. invasion of Panama in 1989. That took just a few days because Panama had almost no real military to speak of. Venezuela today? It's a whole different ballgame. They've got advanced Russian S-300 missile systems and Chinese communication tech. This creates what military planners call a contested electromagnetic spectrum, which is just a fancy way of saying the U.S. couldn't just assume total control of the airwaves and skies like they were used to. Suddenly, the potential cost of a direct invasion just shot through the roof. Okay, so a direct military invasion was looking really costly. But what about that economic attack, the one that wiped out 99% of government revenue? How in the world did the regime survive that? Well, the second clue is in their incredibly creative economic survival plan. Venezuela fought back with this three-part strategy. First, the economy unofficially started using the US dollar, which actually helped tame wild hyperinflation and stabilize things. Second, they built these really sophisticated networks to get around sanctions, finding new partners to trade with. And third, and this is the ironic part, the sanctions accidentally fueled a huge black market in gold and oil smuggling. This created brand new streams of cash that went straight into the pockets of regime loyalists. And this chart right here is the absolute key to their economic survival. See, once they were cut off from their usual markets, Venezuela completely changed where its oil was going. China became the #1 buyer. Russia, Iran, and Turkey also became crucial lifelines. They simply found new customers who were more than happy to ignore Washington's rules. But here's the thing. The most important piece of this whole puzzle isn't just about what Venezuela did internally. The real answer, the big reveal, is about a fundamental shift in the global map itself, a shift that made their survival even possible. You have to understand, for almost 2 centuries, U.S. policy in the region was basically guided by something called the Monroe Doctrine. It was a simple, powerful idea. Latin America was Washington's backyard, its exclusive sphere of influence. And that meant the U.S. felt it had the right to intervene whenever it felt its interests were at stake. And for over 100 years, that doctrine worked. From a CIA-backed coup in Guatemala in '54 to the invasion of Panama in '89, when Washington wanted a government gone in Latin America, it pretty much happened. But as you can see on this timeline, the failure in Venezuela marks the first major break in this very long, very consistent pattern. So the big question is, what changed? The answer, in short, is the rise of a multipolar world. China and Russia gave Venezuela something you could call a multipolar shield. It wasn't a formal alliance, but it was just enough. They provided diplomatic cover at the UN, they offered economic lifelines through trade, and they sold them advanced military gear that made an invasion way too risky. And, crucially, they offered ways to do business outside of the US dollar system, which really blunted America's most powerful weapon, sanctions. And it wasn't just about China and Russia. The pressure on Maduro from his own neighbors also completely fell apart. I mean, look at this. In 2019, more than 60 countries backed the opposition leader. Today, that number has collapsed to just a handful. Key neighbors like Brazil and Colombia are now dead set against any U.S. military action. It just shows you countries in the region now have more options than simply siding with Washington. So why are we spending so much time on this one failed intervention? Because the fallout is huge. It has massive global consequences that stretch way beyond the Caribbean. First, this whole thing basically breaks the American sanctions playbook. For decades, the threat of being cut off from the US dollar was enough to make almost any country fall in line. Venezuela proved that if you can find other economic partners, even catastrophic sanctions are survivable. And that really weakens America's #1 tool of power, especially when you think about bigger rivals. Second, this is about a massive shift in who controls natural resources. Venezuela is sitting on the largest proven oil reserves on the entire planet. The U.S. strategy was to get a friendly government in there that would let American companies develop those resources. That strategy failed. Now it's Chinese and Russian state-owned companies that are lined up to get the biggest slice of the pie. That's a major transfer of economic power. And third, you've got what's called the demonstration effect. The message this sends to every other nation is crystal clear. Defying Washington is no longer a suicide mission. If a country like Venezuela can survive this level of pressure, it gives a green light to others to chart their own course, knowing that American power might not be the final word anymore, not even in its own hemisphere. And you can really see the two competing strategies right here. The US model often relies on pressure, on political demands, on threats. China's model, on the other hand, is purely business, infrastructure investment, resource deals, market access. They really don't care about a country's internal politics. And in the case of Venezuela, that transactional, business-first model proved to be way more effective at building influence. You know, a quote from one of the sources for this explainer just sums it up perfectly. The United States has operated with a Cold War playbook in a post-Cold War reality. They were wrong. The U.S. assumed that the old tools of military and financial power would work just like they always had. But the world had changed. They were running an old playbook in a completely new game. And all of this leaves us with one final, really critical question. The failure in Venezuela wasn't just some tactical mistake. It's a symptom of a much bigger global shift. It showed that American power has real, tangible limits. And if those limits are now showing up in its own hemisphere, it forces us to ask, where else is that power being tested? And where else might it be starting to fade?